1867 Sports Show coming at you again for episode number Darren Fletcher tonight. Kyle Skinner, what's going on, my friend?
I'm amazed we have pried you away from your beloved Oilers game tonight. So this is literally like the opening episode of Seinfeld where it's, I'm taping the Mets game. Don't tell me what the score is. Hello, how are you today?
I'm antsy, man, because like I was telling you, I was trying to rig up a system where I could have it on in the background while I was recording, and wasn't really doing any favors for me. So I bit the bullet. I'm committed to the show, and we're going to be recording extremely quickly tonight, so that way I'm not going to miss too much. But as it stands right now, we're the boys are up 1-0 on another shorthanded goal.
Yeah, the first 13-minute episode in 1867 Sports Show history coming your way tonight, folks. We're here for a good time, not a long time tonight.
Yeah, it's going to be an 1867 short show tonight.
Yeah, oh, look what you did here. You're just a lyricist.
I am a cunning linguist.
I'm gonna leave that one alone for right now, lest we be canceled in the year of our Lord and Savior 2024 here.
I wanted to see if you were actually gonna continue on with that, but I'm happy you didn't. One of us has to take the high road here.
Oh, good Lord. Yeah, we're off to a blistering start here, folks.
That's it for me. Good night, everybody.
Good night, folks. Off and running, almost like two Canadian running backs who I'm thinking you actually have an ulterior motive in our first topic tonight, for the simple reason that before you pitched this idea to me, you were also mentioning a few weeks prior, well, I've got Chase Brown, I've got Jaylen Warren, I don't know which one to keep. So I think you're secretly shoehorning this first topic in tonight, strictly to pick my brain for the upcoming NFL fantasy football draft.
First of all, if anyone's going to be picking your brain about fantasy football, it ain't going to be me. So let's just get that straight right out of the gate here. But yeah, I wanted to discuss a couple of good Canadian boys who are looking at some, potential bell cow work on their respective teams this upcoming season, with Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers and Chase Brown, running back for the Cincinnati Bengals. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this, because obviously football is right around the corner. We're actually in mini camps. We're just finished mini camps right now. Training camps start next month, which is crazy to me. Like it's a month away from training camp. So
mostly because it hasn't felt like summer until today, where all of a sudden we're 40 degrees here in the nation's capital.
All of a sudden it's the nation of Brazil up in Ottawa. But stay cool, everybody. It was a hot one today. But like I said, wanted to discuss the potential for two of these guys to actually make a really big impact, not only on their respective teams, but in the fantasy world as well. Because you and I both know we're degenerates. There's a lot of people like us out there who like the gambling aspect of sports, right? The Jonte Porters of the world love the gambling aspect of sports. The Shohei Ohtanis love the gambling aspects of sports. They're just like us. Yeah. So we wanted to discuss kind of what we've been looking at in regards to Chase Brown versus Chuba Hubbard. If you had to pick one or the other to have the better, or projecting to have the better fantasy season, who would you go with and why? So I'll turn it over to you, because I'm interested to see what your take is here. Not because I'm looking to pick your brain, but because I'm genuinely curious of your, actual opinion on this matter.
I can't wait for you to flip your keeper pick after this episode here, after swearing up and down that I have no ulterior motives for this whatsoever. But I digress.
If you're not going to trade for him, then what's the point?
Yeah. Thank you once again for sticking me with a absolute gem of a team in your home league there. But topic for another day.
Yes, topic for another day. You decided, you paid your money. I'm not to blame for this one.
Well, it's interesting too, right? We've obviously talked a lot about the CFL because it's up and running right now, but with OTAs wrapping up now, two teams kind of going in very different directions here. And to me, you kind of need to separate the prospect from the actual workload and what are the weapons around him here. So in my mind, Hubbard has the more clear path for touches in the easy going, right? You look at their actual profiles here, right? Hubbard, 6'1", 210. Brown, 5'9", 215. They've kind of got a similar running style, but you look at what is in the current Carolina Panthers backfield. It's Hubbard, it's Miles Sanders, who is probably the single biggest offseason signing faux pas of the last couple of years in terms of how much term and money the Panthers threw at him after his breakout season. Weird. Offensive lines actually make a difference in running backs' outcomes. Who would have thunk it?
I'm not going to say it because you know my feelings on the matter, but proceed.
But, so, and then obviously you've got Jonathan Brooks. So out of the gates, I'm going to say Hubbard has the higher upside in the first couple of weeks. That being said, I'm actually more bullish on Brown over the course of the entire season for the simple fact that I'm not worried about Miles Sanders eating into his touches all that much, but Jonathan Brooks is someone who the Carolina Panthers went out there and spent some significant draft capital to acquire. We've seen it time and time again, and I'm a huge proponent of, listen, anytime a running back's coming off an ACL injury, it's not usually the year after, it's usually the year after the year, right? So it's kind of a 2-year return to form here in terms of you look at what Saquon went through, still a very serviceable back his first year back, but he wasn't that true game-breaking talent until the following season, which we saw in his rookie campaign there. So in terms of age, right? You got 25 years old for Hubbard, you got 24 years old for Brown, but you look at the landing spot for Brown, yeah, he's got a little bit of competition there in terms of Zach Moss is kind of the presumptive starter, but I'm not that worried that Zach Moss is all of a sudden going to turn into, Emmitt Smith 2.0 overnight here. We kind of know what he is at this point. And when you are running behind the Bengals offensive line, who we've discussed ad nauseum on other podcasts on the network here, the need to protect Joe Burrow. And they went out and they spent quite a bit of money to revamp that. Is it still a top tier elite offensive line? No, but they're not the turnstiles that are the Carolina Panthers. So in terms of the actual game script they're going to be seeing, Hubbard will probably get his touches early, but they are going to be playing from behind so often that Bryce Young's going to be passing the ball a whole lot more than he's going to be handing it off. Whereas Burrow and Chase and Higgins and all the boys up there in Cincinnati, they're going to be competitive enough that they are going to actually be continuing to run the ball, especially given the fact that they're actually in a cold weather climate. And the longer the season goes on, they're going to put a bigger emphasis on the run game. So all of a sudden, once you get into the fantasy playoffs, Brown is probably a whole lot more appealing than Hubbard, who might at that point of the season have been eclipsed on the depth chart by Jonathan Brooks.
I agree with everything that you're saying. And here's my clear path to either one, becoming the fantasy relevant player this year. So we'll start with Chuba Hubbard going into his third year. He's shown some flashes, in his first 2 seasons, again, on a very mediocre to very subpar Carolina Panthers team. So
those are some very kind words you're using to describe the Carolina Panthers.
For the sake of the argument, I'm trying to keep it as positive as I can. But we all know that Carolina Panthers have secured the first overall pick, whether they've used the actual pick or not, in the last 2 seasons. So the thing to me with Chuba Hubbard is that the one thing that he just hasn't evolved his game towards has been the third down pass blocking, pass catching running back, right? He's been a very good inside the sticks, 2 down back coming out of college. That's what his bread and butter was. If he could take his game to that next level and add that repertoire to his game, I could really see him being not only a fantasy relevant player, but a game-changing player for the Carolina Panthers, because they really don't have that aspect. Is Miles Sanders going to go out there and catch 60, 70 passes for you out of the backfield? No. Is Jonathan Brooks going to do that? If you watch Texas, absolutely not. He's a big physical back, right? So when you look at the options that Carolina has to roll out, Chuba Hubbard, if he can kind of hone in on that aspect of his game, can really become what every NFL team has deemed invaluable, right? Which is the pass catching back who you can put out at any point of the game. So sorry, I'm distracted. I'm just getting updates on my phone. 3-0 for the Edmonton Oilers. So I'm just
yeah, spoiler alert.
Yeah, we're gonna be seeing a more enthused version of myself until until further notice.
Can't believe the Mets blew it in the 9th. Oh my God, Kramer! I was recording the game.
Yeah. Me and Reggie Miller, we got into it. Then we got kicked out of the game. It's so easy to get distracted on this show. It's amazing. But like I said, with Chuba Hubbard, if he can become kind of what and again, I'll go back to the Philadelphia Eagles because they've kind of carved out that exact type of role with every single running back that's come through their system, from the Darren Sproles to the Kenneth Gainwells. Like, they always seem to have that guy who, when he's out in the field, that he's going to be getting the ball probably 50% of the time, right? So he may not get a ton of touches, but when he's out on the field, he's going to be getting some looks. So I think from that perspective, Chuba Hubbard could really make an impact on the fantasy side of things from a PPR one.
Yeah.
Now, going over to the other side with the Cincinnati Bengals and Chase Brown, anyone who watched this guy play last year, that he can burn.
Mm-hmm.
His 0 to 60 speed is incredible. And I think he topped out, he had the second fastest clocked in time last season as a ball carrier next to Tyreek Hill. So when you get guys like that and you give them space, good things happen. Yeah. As we've seen with offenses around the league that are successful. So I think with Chase Brown, 100%, I think that's why Cincinnati was okay cutting Joe Mixon. Mm-hmm. I think that's why Cincinnati wasn't going out and clamoring after one of these top-level backs in free agency. They bring in a guy like a Zach Moss, who's kind of the everyday, he'll give you 150 carries a year and he'll be okay with it, but he's not going to be, the second coming of Ickey Woods or Corey Dillon. Right?
He's the porridge of the backfield right now. He has nutritional value, but is he sexy or exciting? Not really.
No. He's the porridge of the back. So that's his new nickname. Zach Moss, the porridge of the backfield.
Zach Porridge Moss over here.
Zach Bowl of Porridge Moss. But with Chase Brown, I think if he can really come out of the gate and start to show more of that, explosiveness out of the backfield in week 1, you're going to see him kind of take over that lead role sooner rather than later. Mm-hmm. So if I'm a fan of, sleeper running backs this year, Chase Brown's probably going to be my guy. Mm-hmm. And the reason being is that fast people don't grow on trees, right? Like, this is just a thing that if you're lucky enough to have the speed that he has, that's a gift. You got to use it. And like you were saying with Cincinnati, the weapons that they have around him will, again, take more of the defenders outside. So that way they're covering the, uber athletic receiving core that they've got out there. And it allows a guy like Chase Brown to really kind of, make his money either with the, on the run side of things or catching a garbage route and then turning it into something, right? So I think both guys are very relevant options in the fantasy world. I think both guys are very good players to have on your roster from a professional side. And I honestly think that, the state of the Canadian running back in the NFL right now is in good hands with these two guys. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what they can do because, very high on both. And obviously from a selfish perspective, I hope Chase Brown, is that sleeper breakout that I'm looking for.
Oh, okay. So Jaylen Warren is available, is what you're saying now. Trade. I mean, this is exactly what we're talking about here. Is the fact that I think we're in alignment in terms of we both like the players. It's just who has the better situation in front of it. These are two John Cornish Trophy Award winning running backs here who have gone out there, performed at high levels for big schools south of the border, and are now finding themselves with an opportunity to establish themselves as true RB1s in the NFL.
Yeah.
You look at what Cincinnati liked to do with Joe Mixon when they had him, right? He was a true 3-down back, and he was catching bubble screens out of the backfield. And, I think he, for several years, had almost a 50-50 split in terms of receiving touchdowns and rushing touchdowns. Like, he was a versatile weapon.
And may I add, they always seem to come against me when I was against him in fantasy. So I'm actually kind of happy he's away from that situation now. But I'm looking forward to him destroying my fantasy teams when he's on Houston. So continue.
Well, as he continues to destroy your fantasy team by supplanting Dameon Pierce in the backfield, and once again has screwed Kirkwood. But I digress. So Chase Brown really does, like, you look at who he's surrounded by, though, right? Are you that concerned about Zach Moss, Captain America, Chris Evans, Travion Williams? Like, those are serviceable backs, but they are not people who are striking me at the moment, at least, barring some sort of crazy training camp breakout performance that, you get every report in the world. But again, take those with grains of salt, because everyone's always in the best shape of their lives and the fastest they've ever seen them when they're in training camp. But he really does have a unique situation to establish himself as the guy. Whereas when you flip over to Carolina, they've just got so many needs on that roster. I almost envision a situation where Carolina showcases him for the first half of the season and then could potentially flip him pre-trade deadline to recoup some assets for a team that desperately needs every single pick that they can accumulate based on how they've been trading and punting away picks. And even this draft, like, oh yeah, we're going to trade back up in the first round. Like, whole episode could be devoted to David Tepper and what's going on with the Carolina Panthers. But thank God they're not a Canadian franchise, so we don't need to open that Pandora's box. But I genuinely think that whether it's a depth piece or there's an injury for some sort of contending team, he could be someone that you see his name start getting buoyed about there when the trade deadline comes around, because they know, listen, second round pick in Jonathan Brooks, we're going to ease him into it because we know it's kind of, if we can give him a year and a half to recover from the ACL, that's better than the year. And then we'll see what we've got with him there. And he's kind of our back of the future. I see that as kind of the ideal situation, because Hubbard is a talented back, but he's just in a situation where I don't know how much development he's going to get. And I also don't know how many positive game scripts he's going to get to even see double-digit touches in a game moving forward with the team he's currently on.
Yeah, and then to that point, I mean, you look at the surrounding, you've got Albatross contract, second-round rookie, right? Not a recipe for instant success for Chuba Hubbard. But like I said, if he can carve out a role as the pass catcher, you're always going to have a spot. You're always going to be able to put up, some type of relevant, fantasy output. Mm-hmm. And then in the case of Mr. Brown, you've got a mid-level free agent and some also rans. So like the sky's the limit. And if I'm looking at, the scenario from Cincinnati as opposed to the situation in Carolina. But like I said, I think that with the talent that both players possess, they're each capable of having breakout games if given the opportunity. So yeah, I mean, let's see if Carolina can finally take the next step with the new coaching staff for the fifth time in 3 years. And as you vehemently shake your head, no.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. Kyle is not very high in the Carolina Panthers prospect.
Top 5 pick incoming.
And yeah, I'm probably in the same boat. But yeah, I mean, you're looking at a team that is going to be very reliant on their defense to keep them in games, which means that they're probably going to be playing from behind quite often if they're not scoring points, which means that you're probably going to be throwing the ball 30 to 40 times. So yeah, like I said, I love the fact that we're talking about Canadian running backs in the NFL who have a legitimate shot to be the number one guy in their respective backfields, which is, not something that we'd be ever talking about. So again, fantastic. And we'll kind of switch from there because we're talking about a really good, situation for Canadian athletes in their respective sport. And we're going to go to the opposite side of things, because anyone who's been following the state of, MMA in Canada over the last 5 years, you've kind of seen a steady decline in regards to the amount of talent that's come out of this country. I mean, we kind of got spoiled for the longest time because we had the best fighter on the planet who just also happened to be Canadian, George St. Pierre, right? I think every Canadian knew who George St. Pierre was. He was arguably the most popular fighter across the globe at the time, while also being the most dominant. And then you have, some very high level guys with the Rory McDonalds, Mark Hominick, Patrick Cote. You had a litany of Canadian, stud fighters who were always fighting on main cards of UFC events, which is exactly kind of where the MMA fan wants to see. Fast forward to today, and here's a question. And again, I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but can you name me one Canadian fighter in the UFC right now?
I can do a couple, but none of them are challenging for any titles anytime soon. You've got Hakeem Dawodu, Marc-Andre Barriault, and then Jillian Robertson actually has a fight coming up against Michelle, the Karate Hottie, Watterson Gomez. So, but that truly is about the extent of, to a casual fan, you can maybe pick out a couple of names here and there, but they've gone from main eventers to early prelims on these cards, right? Like, it used to be chisel it in stone. What month of the year is the UFC coming to Montreal for a GSP title fight or some sort of, massive pay-per-view? Plus, we're going to do Toronto. Plus, we're going to do Vancouver. Like, at one point, you would literally think that, UFC was going to overtake like baseball in this country in terms of popularity. And it has significantly dwindled since GSP's retirement, right? Even some of the other names that you were mentioning there, Patrick Cote, I think his last fight was 2017. So we're talking about 7 years now. Then you've got Rory McDonald, where, again, UFC, he went over to Bellator for a little bit there. I think it was about 2019. And then he was doing some PFL fights up until 2022. But like, you look at his record and it's just like fighting Robbie Lawlers of the world's headlining pay-per-views, having fight of the year candidates. And then it's just kind of fell off a cliff because there's only so many barroom brawls, which was essentially his fighting style, that you can go through before it catches up with you.
On that type of style, you know what I mean? Like, there really is. So, to your point, I look at kind of where things were, and I mean, I think that you had that, that fantastic camp that came out of Montreal, where you had David Loiseau, George St. Pierre, Patrick Cote, and Rory McDonald, that all came from
the old TriStar gym there.
The old TriStar gym. Yeah, exactly. And, that's kind of what sets the table for, these MMA communities, or these stables of, athletes that kind of come up together, fight together, spar against each other, because iron sharpens iron. If you've got a group of people who are very good at what they do, guess what happens? You get better all the time.
Well, so it's interesting on that point, because I'm genuinely curious, and we're not going to find out until probably, 10 years down the line here, but I'm curious to see whether it's just, all right, generation one, if you call that sort of the GSP generation, they retired, no one took up that mantle, but now all of these guys are in the community kind of developing all these secret little ninja babies out there that are going to take the UFC by storm once they get a little bit older. Or did they kind of just hang up the gloves and walk away? Because if you're retiring from professional sports, you're getting less eyeballs on the Canadian product, and B, if you're not then getting into coaching, it's also leaving a void in these gyms that they're training at, right? So it almost has a double whammy effect of it. And again, I'm not plugged into the fight scene enough to know whether they're out there training 4 days a week with a whole bunch of teenage kids that are going to be that next wave or not. Maybe one of our listeners can put in the comments on YouTube whether they are. But if not, like, it's not looking very bright for the Canadian MMA community, because it kind of fell off a cliff once that first wave of fighters ultimately retired.
Yeah. And I think, I'll kind of go sidetracked here, but the most successful Canadian fighter since that, generation one kind of left the scene was Olivier Aubin-Mercier. And he was a very successful fighter, had some success on the Ultimate Fighter show, in the UFC, and then transitioned over to the PFL and Bellator circuit. But now he's just hung up the gloves because he's had enough. He won titles, and that's pretty much
he
it.
Got tired of getting punched in the face.
Yeah,
eventually it gets old, eh?
Exactly, 100%. So, you mentioned two names, right off the top of people that you do recognize their names, because really, I think any MMA fan, those are probably the two that are really kind of the standout Canadians at this point. So Jillian Robertson, obviously, is an up and comer. She's young. So this could be, the next big fighter coming from Canada. But let's put things in perspective. Like, she's the number 15 ranked strawweight in the women's division in the UFC, right?
But before you move on from her, like this is kind of a really good fight for her coming up, because Michelle Waterson is a household name, right? She's on the backside of her career. Some are even kind of floating it out that if she loses this one, her contract's kind of done with the UFC.
Yeah.
But it's a name that she can kind of put a check mark next to. So she will potentially move up with a victory. And I think Michelle Waterson's only got like 2 wins in her last 9 fights or something. So this is a big fight for her on June 29th coming up.
These are the gatekeeper fights that the UFC really likes to, and even boxing does this too. They like to test these young fighters with people who know how to go the distance, because it's easy when you're in there, you're knocking people out in a round, you're submitting people within a few minutes. What happens when you get taken into those deep waters and you really have to test your cardio against like a seasoned veteran like a Michelle Waterson? So 100%, I think that this is a really good stepping stone for her if she's able to kind of overcome this. But again, like I said, let's put things in perspective. We're not trying to anoint, Miss Robertson as the next big thing, but she's kind of
our only hope.
She's kind of the beacon of light right now in the Canadian MMA scene, because like you were saying, like there's really a lack of names. Like, Hakeem Dawodu, who, he had a pretty good run a couple years ago where he was kind of ascending the featherweight ranks of the UFC. And the last 3 fights that he's been in, we've just kind of seen that, again, shining, like we see with so many MMA people, their shining star just comes crashing right back down to earth. I think he's on a 2-fight losing streak. If he loses his next fight, that's probably going to be it for him in the UFC, right? So, I mean, those were the 2 names when I was looking it up. It's like, names to watch, in the Canadian MMA, scene in 2024, Jillian Robertson, Hakeem Dawodu. And when you've got someone who's a name to watch and they're on the decline of their potential career, not exactly, setting a good example for the rest of the fighters in, on the male side. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of where things are. And I think you're right by saying it's kind of like an influx situation where you see talent upon talent upon talent, and then a big drop off. And then you start to see the build back up. And that's the thing, right? With MMA, the drop is so quick. So you'll see, 5 to 10 years of this ascension for these fighters. And that's how long it takes to get them to be household names. And then all it takes is one fight and they're back down at the bottom. And that's why the level of consistency that Generation 1 group of fighters had, we kind of took for granted.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, let's just hope that this is kind of a blip on the radar, and we're going to start to see more of these, young up and comers, really starting to make their way. Because I mean, obviously, you've got more options than ever at this point, because you've got, the UFC, which has different iterations now. So, like, you have the Dana White Fight Series, you've got the Ultimate Fighter show. These are where these prospects are discovered and make names for themselves, right? You've got the PFL. You've got, other organizations that are not as, high level as some of these other organizations like a Bellator or, the aforementioned Strike Force or Affliction, or the ones that have gone the way of the dodo. But you've got options now where learning, the game of MMA is probably more prominent now than ever before. So this is why it's kind of weird to me, because we're always talking about the development of Canadian sports, right? You're seeing, milestones being reached, and you're seeing all of these different, you know, kind of sports that were a blip on the radar now becoming mainstream. Whereas, you know, MMA has really kind of taken the opposite approach where it was mainstream for so long, and now we're back down to square one. So I'm optimistic. I really hope that, you know, the MMA scene in Canada picks up, and we get to see some more of these, you know, large camps coming from different parts of the country, because this is, again, it's a sport that a lot of people have eyes on. It's an international sport. Let's get it back on the radar.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly one of the reasons that you can kind of attribute to this, I guess, decline in kind of Canadian talent, right? Is it has gone from a predominantly North American plus Brazil sport to a truly international sport, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't think too many people had, you know, Dagestan as, you know, the number one outputter of championship fighters on the planet on their bingo card 10 years ago, right? But here we are.
Here,
Right. And so I really think it is kind of a cyclical thing where other countries have kind of caught up to where Canada was. And when you're now cherry picking the best fighter from Albania and England and, you know, all these other locales across the planet, and you're kind of expecting the same level of, yeah, we want one or two contenders at every weight class like it used to be in the
yeah,
old days. It's just not going to happen. That
yeah,
being said, though, like you were saying, you know, I think athletics in Canada has taken a lot of steps forward. This is not an area where they can kind of point towards as far as like, look at all the development here. And, you know, maybe it is just the fact that it's a combat sport, and so when you're trying to drum up funding for something, people are more likely to sponsor a Girl Guides scout troop than they are, yeah, Timmy wants to go beat the crap out of a bunch of other neighborhood kids around here. So
yeah.
maybe it's a funding thing, but there's clearly something that has changed. And what that is, for those that are in the MMA community, it's something to take a look at, because it's not going to magically fix itself all overnight.
And like, and we're talking about MMA, but like, I think you can put the whole combat sport realm in the same, you know, in the same capacity, because even boxing. I
How
mean,
many Canadian boxers can you name since Lennox Lewis?
I mean, there was it was a Jean Pascal who was
You could be
the
making up names for all I know right now.
he's probably,
Jean-Philippe from Trois-Rivières, Quebec.
probably he's probably the only one. But I mean, we had two of the most exciting heavyweight boxers ever who were Canadian, you know, and obviously Lennox Lewis was a citizen. But we had Lennox Lewis and Donovan Razor Ruddock, fantastic heavyweight boxer. And yeah, you know, ever since then, like I said, I think Jean Pascal is probably the only Canadian boxer that I could probably name. I mean, you look at Arturo Gatti, he was a Canadian boxer, but yeah, I look at the whole combat sport realm, and it's kind of in the same boat. So are we in a situation where people are more hesitant to put their children into things like boxing and mixed martial arts because of fear of injury?
Mm-hmm.
Probably a, you know, good factor behind that. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's about getting kids involved in something, right? If they're not into soccer, try them at something else. If they're not into, you know, golf, try them at something. Like, there's always something to go out there. And I think that the mixed martial art combat sport realm just requires such a level of discipline and hard work that there aren't a lot of families, not let alone kids, but a lot of families that aren't willing to put in the amount of effort it takes to do that. And that's fine. Like, I'm not criticizing anybody, but there's more than meets the eye when it comes to, oh, I'm just going to register them for this. Like, there's a lot of things that you have to take into account and really make an educated decision on when you're putting your child into something like a combat sport. So, yeah, let's see, you know, what happens. I know you and I have had the conversation about, you know, putting our youngest into.
I can't wait for the cage match of Harper against whoever her sparring partner is going to be at some point there. Godspeed to that other kid. Yeah. She's got energy for days.
Okay, well, you know what? And that's where the professional wrestling thing comes in. Harper and June can be the, you know, kind of the new iteration of the Road Warriors.
Yeah. And you've got the shoulder pads. We just need to attach some spikes to them, and they're off to the races here, bud.
Exactly. So, yeah, like I said, I being an avid MMA fan that I am, I'm really hoping that we see, an ascension, back to where Canadian MMA was in a good spot, because it's always great when you're seeing these homegrown products succeed. And yeah, I mean, let's get the UFC coming back to places like Ottawa, like Vancouver, like Edmonton, like the small, not say Vancouver small, but the places that aren't Toronto and Montreal, right? And again, even the PFL, have they ever come to Canada?
I don't know. We're here. We're just a little bit north of where you usually do business here, folks.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, I'm really hoping for the best here, and contrary to what we normally do, I'm gonna get a stern dad look at the at the people involved with Canadian martial arts and boxing and any form of combat sport. Get on your stuff here, people. Stern dad looks aplenty. Let's go. Get it back going here.
Been a few episodes since we busted out the stern dad.
Yeah. And again, we've kept things pretty positive the last, I want to say 6 to 7 episodes. We haven't had to have many of those, but yeah, it's time for a stern dad look. So, happy to toss one at Canadian combat sports way.
Well, just to completely flip this episode on its head here, you are clearly going to be stern dad looking. I'm going to give some golf claps here, because I actually had to do not to poo-poo on any of these individuals, but I had to do a little bit of research to even come up with who are the Canadian boxers to kind of watch. Why I'm subjecting myself to having to pronounce names here, I have no idea. But
it's my favorite part of the show. It's literally
it's a glutton for punishment over here. But I am going to give golf claps to the following individuals here. At light heavyweight, we've got Ryan Rosicki out of Nova Scotia. Super lightweight, Arthur the Wolf Byars-Lanoff. Super middleweight, Lexin Mathieu from Quebec. We had lightweight, Jessica Camara, and welterweight, Josh Lupia. Apparently, these are people to keep an eye on there. So golf clap to them. Everyone else, you get stern dad looks, though.
And we're sterner than ever right now, so you're going to be getting the biggest glare in the world. But yeah, I mean, hey, if that's the group of young talent that we've got coming up in the country for boxing, yeah, let's keep a good eye on them and let's see how their careers progress. Because again, we it's been a while. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Speaking of a while,
so subscribe to the Nine Sports YouTube page, 1867 Sports Show.
Exactly. Yeah, do that first, and then go about your day after that. But like I was gonna say, speaking of a while, do you know what the anniversary? It was 2024. You know what anniversary it is, Kyle?
I do, because you told me what topics we were going to talk about. the Montreal Expos canceled season.
You know what? And this is why
30 years ago.
This is why we're not running an improv class, because you're not really buying what I'm selling here. But
I'm not giving you the yes and responses.
The yes and So yes, Kyle, the 2024 baseball season is the 30-year anniversary of the 1994 Montreal Expos legendary season before the baseball strike. And anyone who either wasn't around or wasn't following baseball back then, yes, Montreal did have a team, and they were a very good team around this time frame. So maybe just kind of touching on that particular season, like, were you watching baseball much at this time?
I was 6, but the reason that I know more than I probably should about not only the 1994 Montreal Expos, but just the Expos in general is my grandfather on my mom's side was a devout Montreal Expos fan. So I have heard many a gripe about the lost season that was 1994 and the players' strike, and how baseball didn't want to see a Canadian team win the World Series again, and every other conspiracy theory you can come up with. So, oh yes, I know a thing or two about the early 90s Montreal Expos, despite my young age at that time.
Yeah. And the reason why it's kind of outside of the strike aspect of it, the reason why this season was kind of, legendary and memorable It was because obviously the 2 seasons that preceded this, we saw the Canadian Toronto Blue Jays win the World Series, which is the first time it's ever happened. So the fact that it was looking like it was going to be back-to-back World Series happening in Canada, that was pretty amazing, right? If you're a Canadian baseball fan, that was a pretty great time. And then obviously, the strike happened, the season got canceled, and we didn't have a World Series that year. And if anybody wants to kind of see a little behind the scenes look at this, they don't really touch on it much, but they do a little bit. In this miniseries, The Captain, about Derek Jeter, this was Derek Jeter's first year in the big leagues, 1994. And they talked about how great the Yankees team was that year. And it was looking like it was going to be the Yankees and Expos that were going to meet in the World Series. And then the season got canceled. And they kind of touch on how good that Expos team was. And I'm going to rattle off some names here of that Expos team. And again, anyone who's familiar with baseball, there's a lot of big names that have come through the Montreal organization.
Mm-hmm.
But this particular iteration was just stacked with all-stars, legendary, players, Hall of Famers. It was fantastic. So we started off the show by saying it was episode number Darren Fletcher, number 24. Darren Fletcher was an all-star catcher for the Montreal Expos that season. Okay. Joining him on the infield were 2 other future Hall of Famers, tongue-tied here. Future all-stars.
You're doing so well.
Good times
golf claps for Kyle. There we go.
For not being able to talk. All right. It's been a long day, folks.
With me, it's last names. With you, it's just general English, apparently.
Talking, So anyways, joining him in the infield, take 3, 2 future all-stars, Mike Lansing and Cliff Floyd. Okay, so Cliff Floyd played first base, Mike Lansing played second base. Do you want to hear what this outfield looked like, Kyle?
It was probably the greatest outfield that you will see assembled, not only offensively, but defensively as well, too.
And the thing is, their 4th outfielder was better than most teams' starting outfield.
Yep.
So, Moises Alou in right field.
He coached by his dad.
Yeah.
Underreported storyline there, but continue.
Marquise Grissom in center field, many-time All-Star, and Hall of Famer and Canadian Larry Walker in left field.
He was a popular lad in Montreal in the early 90s.
Very popular player, not only in Montreal, but in Colorado. Yeah. And Larry Walker is, it was so nice to see him finally get into the Hall of Fame because
his last crack too.
Yeah. And that was kind of I think it was kind of fitting that it was his last crack because, it meant more to him. And I think that Canadians really rallied around that, but I digress. Their 4th outfielder was again a future all-star, Rondell White.
Mm-hmm.
So you look at that, there's 7 players out of 8 in the field that are all-star players, right? Now we go over to the pitching side, and this is where it even gets better because all 4 of the starting pitchers are going to name were all-stars at one point as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention their all-star closer. So now we're at 5. So in their starting rotation, we have, again, one of the best of all time, Pedro Martinez. A lot of people forget that he started out with the Montreal Expos.
Yeah.
So Pedro Martinez, Kirk Ruder, who is one of the best left-handed pitchers in the game for a number of years with Montreal and San Francisco. Ken Hill, who ended up becoming one of the World Series starters for the Cleveland Indians at the time and the New York Yankees in the 90s. And Jeff Fassero, who seemed to pitch forever. I think he pitched until he was about 43 years old.
He may still be pitching to this day. It's unconfirmed.
He's a left-handed pitcher. We know that those guys last forever. So there's 4 all-star pitchers in your starting 5 pitching staff, which is, again, ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And you also had the best closer in baseball at the time in John Wetland, who is a multi-time World Series champ with the New York Yankees and a multiple-time All-Star. So if you're keeping track at home, you're now at 12 All-Stars on the Montreal Expos 1994 almost World Series roster.
Mm-hmm. Plus, who is in the dugout calling all the shots? Felipe Alou, who also is one of the most legendary managers of all time as well, too. Former player, obviously one of the Alou brothers, and at one point was formed an actual outfield with all of his brothers out there.
Exactly. So, I mean, you look at that, collaboration of talent. All these guys are young. Mm-hmm. They're all in their 20s. Can you imagine if this team stuck together? If Montreal actually had an ownership that could actually, fund the team?
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's the Expos were not doomed by fans. They were not doomed by the on-field product. They were not doomed by any, misfortunate signings. It was sheer mismanagement on the ownership side that ultimately resulted in them moving to Washington in 2005 and eventually winning a World Series, mostly based off the foundation that they had already laid. But again, like the Montreal Expos in 1994, 74-40 when the season got canceled. Number one team in all of baseball.
Yep.
That was a 649 winning percentage. If you extrapolate that over a full season, that's a 105 win season.
Yeah.
For those that don't follow baseball that much, anytime a team goes over 100 wins, it's a big deal. Yeah. So this would literally be the modern day equivalent right now of the New York Yankees, who are currently have the best record in baseball, much to my chagrin as a Boston Red Sox fan, essentially just being like, you know what? We're just going to play up to the All-Star break and then you just go home. Like that is literally essentially what happened to the Montreal Expos here. They were having the best season of any National League team, 5 All-Stars that season alone representing the Expos. And because of off-field issues through no fault of their own, kind of had the rug pulled out from under them. Because I can almost guarantee you, if it was shaping up to be a Dodgers-Yankees World Series, that season would have finished.
Yeah, I 100% agree. But, let's put conspiracy theories aside and just look at the landscape of where baseball was at the time. Really, you look at where baseball was going until you went through the steroid era. Mm-hmm. Baseball was just on a downward spiral for about 10 years. And then you've got the 1998 season where you've got Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa.
Juiced up to the eyeballs.
Up to the eyeballs. But again, who wants to hear the terrifying truth? Or who wants to see me sock a few dingers? Like, that's just the way that people got captivated back with baseball. It took that long to get back.
I legitimately remember being a kid, and that summer was also when the Phantom Menace was coming out. And if you remember, all the pop cans had Star Wars things on it. So it was literally, we would play baseball. Mm-hmm. We would then go to the canteen, try and get one of the new ones to add to our collection there. And then we would try and find the updates on who socked more home runs the night before. Is it McGwire? Yeah. Is it Sosa? Who's winning the home run race right now?
Yeah.
It also didn't hurt that, Cardinals, Cubs, 2 historic franchises, natural rivalry. Like the story wrote itself. So you can see why people would glob onto that for sure.
But it was just kind of an unfortunate situation in 1984 because that kind of fell right in the middle of when baseball was kind of at its hottest in the 70s and 80s. And you see kind of that 90s era that's kind of like, all right, we're starting to see a little bit of a decline in viewership. Fan attendance was at an all-time low. 1994 kind of hits, and it's like, well, it's all coming to a culmination right now, right? And 100%. You saw a lot of teams that had a lot of mismanagement going on. Like I want to say out of the, 27 teams they had at the time, I would say they probably had 3 or 4 stable ownerships. Mm-hmm. And the rest were pretty much just what's going to happen this week. Are going to be able to turn the lights on.
Who's Mr. Steinbrenner going to fire this week?
And I mean, we'd be remiss if we didn't do a big Stein, impression from Seinfeld. But again, I look at kind of where things were netting out for the Expos, and it was kind of a long time coming. with them because it started in 1969, built their way up. They had a very, successful run in the late 70s and early 80s. And then as you saw kind of that, again, we'll say generation one of really legit talent that Montreal had, like the Andre Dawsons and the Tim Raines and the Gary Carters kind of leave town. How are you going to build that back up? Well, this was that group, right? This was that group that they had kind of drafted, put together, traded for, that was making this roster what they were. So, I mean, they were doing all the right things, because if you're going to rebuild, you do it quickly. And these guys turned things around extremely quickly. And it's just a shame that that happened, because not only did it affect that season, but long term, that's what doomed the Expos. Yeah. Was that if they go to the World Series and win, they'd probably still have a team in Montreal today.
Yeah. And that's exactly what the main issue here was the fact that it's a predominantly American league that they play out of, right? There can be every argument in the world that south of the border at that time, viewership, interest in the game, attendance was all on the decline. It was never hotter than it was between 1990 and 1995 in Canada because of the Blue Jays success, because of the Expo success, even with canceled seasons, right? Like these are teams that were perennially contending. And I'm sure if you do a deep dive on registration at grassroots, baseball, softball, t-ball, everything, it was never higher than during that 5-year period. So it was one of those things where essentially the Expos got screwed because of issues going on south of the border, and the players need to strike because the owners think that they're getting paid too much, and we need a CBA, we need a I get it, right? Baseball's obviously in a healthy spot now, largely because of that lost season, but it did come at the expense of that franchise.
Yeah. And to anyone who would like to kind of see more of what we're talking about, Netflix has greenlit a documentary about said Montreal Expos from 1990 to when they left in 2002, 2003, 2005. So they actually have a documentary that's been greenlit that they're going to be doing on those Expos teams, which I actually can't wait for. I think it's going to be good.
Yeah, it's going to be so good too, because you even look at, even if you're comparing apples to apples and you compare kind of the Blue Jays to the Expos, like you were saying, the Expos literally had generational and interesting and captivating all world players throughout their existence, right? It was ultimately financial constraints and off-field mismanagement that ended up torpedoing their chances of succeeding. But you literally went from the Tim Raineses and the Gary Carters of the world to everyone we just rattled off there, the Larry Walkers, the Pedro Martinez. Hey, go check what uniform Randy Johnson is wearing on his rookie card. It's a Montreal Expos uniform. And then once you even get past that, now you're into the Vladimir Guerrero era and all of that. Like, even with the Blue Jays, you kind of had those World Series teams. And then talk to the Blue Jays fan in your life. It was a dead period for about 12 to 15 years.
Carlos Delgado and Roy Halladay. That was pretty.
There you go. I was literally going to say there were two players that everyone will default to, Doc and Delgado. And aside from that, it was just a lot of like, well, are we not going to finish in last in the AL East, or are we going to finish in last? That was the extent of kind of that 12-year period. The Expos were always frisky in terms of their competitiveness.
That's good.
Yeah. And so they were always interesting. And even, towards the later iterations where it was, no one's turning up to the games. Like, I remember as a kid going to Expos home games in the early 2000s. And it wasn't a packed baseball stadium, but it certainly wasn't like the Oakland A's, who are drawing 3,000 fans a game right now out to the Coliseum out there. So it was entirely off-field stuff. But the reason this documentary is going to be so interesting is there is no shortage of compelling stories, and the cast of characters they're going to be able to draw upon it's Hall of Famer after Hall of Famer after All-Star, and some of the, most interesting interviews off the field as well, too.
Yeah. And, it's funny because I was actually going to mention the Randy Johnson thing before you got to it, but can you imagine a pitching staff that had Randy Johnson and Pedro Martinez on it?
Yeah. Like the funny part is, like, if you actually go and look at the 1994 Expos stats, like Martinez had a good year, but he was arguably the third or fourth best statistical pitcher
Yeah.
on that team that year, which
Yeah.
is insane to think about because, yeah, he wasn't, the absolute dominant force that he was when he was with the Red Sox, but he was no slouch at that time either.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's what, again, here's a trivia question. Who did
False.
who is but who did the Expos get back in the Randy Johnson trade?
Oh, that is a good question, actually.
It's another left-handed pitcher who was an all-star at the time.
I don't know.
And he only played one season for Montreal because he got ran out of town because he was deemed to be a little bit of a diva.
Still don't know who it is, but great return for Randy Johnson right there.
Yeah.
What one season out of a quasi diva-esque left-hander. Awesome.
The answer would be Mark Langston,
okay,
who actually had his best baseball with the California Angels after his short stint with the aforementioned Montreal Expos. So fantastic future scouting on the Expos part there.
Yeah. Well done, gentlemen.
And here's another one for you too.
Oh, you just full of them tonight, eh?
It has another Canadian spin on it too. So 1993, the Blue Jays are making a run to their second World Series, and trade deadline comes around, and they acquire arguably the all-time best leadoff hitter in baseball with Ricky Henderson. Do you know that Randy Johnson was supposed to be the player that the Blue Jays were going to get? But what happened was Pat Gillick, who was the GM of the Blue Jays.
Oh, Pat.
He threw out two trade offers, one to the Oakland Athletics and one to the Seattle Mariners. And he said, whoever gets back to me first, that's who we're making the trade with. So Oakland came back and said, yeah, I think we can make that work, but we have to get Ricky's approval first because he had a no trade clause.
Mm-hmm.
Randy Johnson had a no trade, or didn't have a no trade clause. So while Oakland is going to check with Ricky Henderson, Seattle calls and says, hey, we have a deal. We're going to send you Randy Johnson. Pat Gillick, being, a man of his word and wanted to be honorable, said, well, I actually just agreed to a trade with Oakland, so I'm going to wait to see what they say with Ricky Henderson and then get back to you. Randy Johnson had 4 more years of control after that season. So you talk about those down years that the Blue Jays had. Would look a little better if you had Randy Johnson and Roy Halladay as your number one.
I was going to say, not to mention the fact that Randy Johnson also pitched another decade plus after that as well, too. So, yeah, it's the sliding glass door moments are probably no bigger in any sport than in baseball, just because of how many rounds they used to do in the drafts. Like, they used to literally do like 35 plus rounds. Like, it was ridiculous. And you've actually got all of these farm systems that are tiered properly, so you can stash all these prospects. And so teams that are in win now mode, I don't care what he can do 6 years from now. If I can get a pennant or a World Series hung up on the scoreboard out there, I'm going to take that over. I might not even be around by the time this kid makes his MLB debut, right? So it's not like hockey or basketball or football where you get drafted, and if you're a first rounder, you're probably playing immediately and significant minutes as well too.
Yeah.
Baseball is the slowest simmering sport. So you will, if you go back through, if you're ever bored, one day and you have an internet connection, go look through some of the most lopsided trades. Because at the time, it's like, I don't know who this Dominican 18-year-old kid is here. He could be left-handed, could be right-handed. I don't know. Sure, you can have him, and I'll take this veteran who maybe is only going to be with us for 3 months, but helped us win a World Series here. And then, oh crap, that turned out to be Vladimir Guerrero.
And you know what? And there's a future episode that I was just thinking about before you even mentioned it. We're going to evaluate all of the most lopsided trades in Canadian sports team history. So not just baseball, across all sports.
Methinks Gretzky might be involved at some point there.
It's going to be a 20-part series.
Yeah.
But no, you know what? But again, looking back, 30 years is obviously a long time. The Expos are still, on everyone's kind of, the back of their mind in Canada, because every time the Tampa Bay Rays struggle, or one of these teams is having a low attendance period, it's like, well, move them up to Montreal, we'll support them and everything. It's like, at what stadium?
Yeah,
right.
Well, I was gonna say, the dream is not dead to at least one person, because I don't know if you've seen this or not. How they got a hold of the credentials, maybe it's just a fact that Twitter and Instagram and that didn't exist back in 2000, so someone just created it. But the Expos social media accounts are very alive and well. They are posting all the time, and any single time there's anything about how Oakland's got no attendance, or their new stadium in Vegas has been delayed, like the first one in the comment section is like a big checkmark verified account of Montreal Expos with some remark of, oh, well, we know where you could bring it. So whoever is running these phantom accounts, golf clap to you, because you are keeping the dream of baseball alive in La Belle Province.
And let's hope by the year 2054, we're looking back and saying 30 years ago, Montreal was just an afterthought. And now they're a multi-time World Series championship franchise that, has reinvigorated the Canadian sport landscape in Montreal. So anyways, on that note, good job by you tonight, my friend.
Yeah, good job by you. What's the score in the Oils game?
4-2, second intermission. We're looking good.
Oh my goodness, the longer we've been talking, they're clawing their way back in it here. Better get you back to your regularly scheduled cheering.